gets hungry at night and who watches you sleep from your window? No, it's not Santa. It's Count Dracula. Santa doesn't exist.
The vampire is intrinsically male. The penetrative fangs, the social status, the physical superiority, which is used to hunt, positioning an individual as prey, all things associated with male dominance. These characteristics proposition the female vampire as inherent hermaphrodites.
In both Dracula and Carmilla, the female vampire doesn't represent its sex, that is, female naturally, but rather acts as an antigender.
The binary poses the vampiress closer to androgyny. She is seen hunting young women, much like young men would engage in courting. Her disposition, writes Catherine Powers in Fangs and Femininity, both reflects and reinforces societal restrictions on women's sexual agency, heteronormativity, and general independence. At its core, the hungry female vampire is a cautionary tale of what female sexuality might evolve to look like if unchecked and uncontrolled by men. For the Victorians, the man was the spiritual being, the one closer to God and philosophy, while the woman was the carnal being, mistress of a home and of the...
Now, the natural course of that sentence would be bedroom, but we both know that women aren't allowed to express sexual desires. Now, are they?
While enlightened, the man was the only being who could possibly experience carnal lust. Oh, a woman could never. But lucky for us, the vampiress isn't female. Her sexuality is forward and aggressive, mirroring more the human male, and is paired with her desire for blood. The horror the vampiress is inducing in men is not only of an erotic order, but rather a fear of domination. The female vampire doesn't live in a gendered hierarchy, displays strong independence and power, not just of a sexual kind, but also physical. The idea of an independent woman loses its appeal for the male audience the moment her eventual subjugation is erased from the narrative. Desire is replaced by repulsion and fear. The sexual moment, one in which the male is used to reinforcing power structures, is flipped around. The human male plays the feminine submissive part, while the vampiress is the active participant in the communion, controlled by her mad desire and disregard of her partner's feelings. The violation of consent is an essential part of the vampire mythos, erasing the control her victims might have had and endangering their lives for her own pleasure transforms the blood-sucking ritual from erotic and stimulating to terrifying. But for this mirroring of events traditionally experienced by women at the hands of men, the vampires becomes a representation of what men fear gender equality might look like. There is no true equality that a man raised in a patriarchal society can envision. The notion largely assumed is that women would become male for their behavior, as it is impossible to conceptualize being brought to the female level, and there is no clear understanding of accepting the two binaries coexisting in balance. Men have always feared equality for this reason, thus seek to ridicule it, masking their fear. The oppressor views the liberation of the oppressed as an attack on its own rights. Thus, a woman expressing her sexuality with the same liberty a man would marks the beginning of a man's demise. It is portrayed in Dracula through Harker's encounter with the female vampires, and in many other non-vampiric pieces of media to follow and beforehand. One might argue the first woman expressing her sexuality in a way that both terrifies and excites the male is Eve, whose gain of autonomy is directly juxtaposed to the loss of autonomy of her male counterpart. The possibility of acting of your own accord, the first act of independence and rebirth, is exemplified both in the Bible and in the vampiric canon through eating.
A baby's first instinct when it comes into the world is to nurse. A woman's, to starve.
The complete defiance of a female vampire comes not through her hunger, but through her feasting. The grotesque glutton, which is the vampiress, completely goes against the Victorian culture of anorexia and serves as an active agent.
Now, even though undead, a vampire will act more alive than a woman. It will eat, speak, and do how it pleases.
Women are stuck in the confines of a home, in the perpetual cycle of caring for others. A woman is supposed to cook for her family, but never eat herself. The vampires, in juxtaposition, not only doesn't nourish others, but feeds on the ones around her. often children. There is no coincidence that the archetype of a vampire as we know it today is so reflective of a Victorian period rather than traditional texts or creatures. Stoker's vampire doesn't necessarily represent the fear of a monstrous for the locals, where vampiric creatures are called strigoi or moroi, but more so the Western fear of the Oriental Eastern.
Defying norms in a culture of restriction and conformity, the vampire embodies both the primitive desire and the psychological hunter.
The vampires is stripped from the feminine characteristics of what a woman would or should exemplify, and in turn takes the form of a monstrous feminine. No better place is this illustrated than in Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, where the brides embody the fallen woman and the monstrous, combining features of both cannibalism and lesbianism. The brides expressing sexual desire for each other intensifies their foulness, and their villainous is manifesting not only through making Jonathan unfaithful to Mina and almost killing him, but also through their very monstrous nature.
Under this logic, monstrosity and sexuality go hand in hand, as many of the rejected societal practices of incest, sexual perversion, and homosexuality reflect the fear of a deviant sexuality.
The monster embodies those sexual practices that must not be committed or that may be committed only through the body of a monster. The monster's deviant sexuality is linked to its outlaw status, the outgroup shunned by proper society. The fact that these unacceptable practices are embodied by monsters make them obvious examples of how not to behave. The vampire's sexuality is terrifying not only through her ability to captivate, but through her possible erotic disinterest in men. The female vampire is abject because she defies the natural order of the living and the laws for proper sexual conduct.
The living fear the dead, men fear women, so where does this position the dichotomy that is the female vampire?
Both the male and the female are deviant in vampirism. The mouth contains both the vagina dentata and the penetrative fangs, making the vampire a perfect hermaphrodite, through which sexuality and the sexual act itself are conducted orally. This thesis is supported by Lucy's character in Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is clearly inspired by both Medusa and Eve, with snake symbolism in her attire and with blood dripping from her fangs, echoing the fear of a vagina dentata, which could castrate men with its teeth.
A bloody mouth is a bloody vagina. This is gendered blood. It's dangerous, threatening, disgusting, and fascinating. Blood marks death, but it also reminds us of a feminine creative power.
Simone de Beauvoir wrote how the little girl, not yet in puberty, carries no menace, she is under no taboo. But on the day she can reproduce, woman becomes impure, and rigorous taboos surround the menstruating female. Freud thought they stem from the repression of an attraction to menstruating women, while Bruno Bettelheim thought menstruation was a source of male envy over the procreative powers of a female body. If in vampire stories there is a fetishization of menstrual blood, there is also a recognition that these are disordered bodies, unnatural people who need to be controlled and contained. So, how is Lucy defeated? Her fiancé, therefore guardian, Arthur, penetrates her body with a phallic male virility triumphing over the fear of castration by female voracious sexuality. He also chops her head off, following Perseus' example. Lucy is then restored to premenstrual purity and buried in a wedding gown, signifying her effort of performing femininity properly before being diverted from that path by a vampiric death. Unlike the brides of Dracula, who embody the vampiress, therefore inhuman and resemble the biblical model of Lilith, Lucy is a woman seduced by the monster, Eve. As Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu puts it in Carmilla, it is the nature of vampires to increase and multiply. The fear around the vampiress is that she would turn more women-defiant through its example and corrupt the Puritan, weaker sex. The vampiress nature is so antithetical to everything a Victorian woman is supposed to embody, her existence terrifies and excites. To women, freedom might just taste like blood, and the vampiress disrupts the heteronormative order by seducing women not only through the awakening of sexual feelings, supposedly unheard of for the Victorians, but for showing them what an existence with no subjugation might look like. For that, she must be punished. Of course, in this context, men are able to both enjoy the fantasy of erotic interaction with a seductive vampiress and oppress real women's ability to engage in these actions.
So who's the vampiress? Or what is she? A deformed woman or the shadow of fear? A manifestation of liberation at the cost of life? From satanic creature to modern feminist icon, the vampire represents the other in all of its forms. Grotesque, queer, female, a source of comfort for some or horror for others, we might like to believe we have gone a long way from a Victorian conception of women. But when modern women still starve themselves thin, dedicate their lives to the service of others, and confine their sexuality within institutionally approved forms, the vampiress might still lurk the night, waiting for her next victim to bite into. Or maybe to set free.